Okay, good evening everyone. Welcome to A Tale of Two Trawlers by Chester Sub-Aqua Club. My name's Justin Owen. I'm basically just a diver with Chester Sub-Aqua Club. I also serve on the committee as welfare officer. And the following presentation, the following talk, basically condenses around 2 years of diving and research into around 60 or 70 slides. So it's not too tenuous. We've just picked out all the best bits to take you through the story this evening. There was three of us that predominantly put all this work together. That was myself, Chris Holden and Nigel Cossons, but also all the divers of Chester Sub-Aqua Club got involved and contributed towards this and put up with us diving the same two wrecks for a period of about 2 years. So it was very, very much a club effort. So without further ado, got a fair bit to get through. We will crack on. So where did it all begin? Well, it basically just began as a weekend out scuba diving off the coast of Anglesey. So in 2005, Chris was actually doing a lot of research at this point for his books, The Underwater Guides to North Wales. So we were looking at quite a few wrecks, ones we hadn't dived before, and trying to get a bit more information about them. And we dived a site known as both the Lady Windsor and the Tug off the coast of Anglesey. And it was a pretty challenging day out on the boats, let's put it that way. If you've ever dived Anglesey, you know the conditions can be quite challenging. We had very poor viz, a pretty big plankton bloom at the time, and we had much stronger than expected currents, which caused us quite a few issues. Some of us vowed never to visit the site ever again. It was that challenging. But we got through it. We came back in 2006. And we found a lot better conditions underwater than we did the first time round. And these are a few of the images off that second dive. So this is, as it was at the time, the Lady Windsor or the Tug wreck. So you can see that typical green tinge of British waters, but really good visibility for Anglesey. And we were able to pick out some features on the wreck here. You can see the rudder and the prop, a hoop on the side of the hull at the time, which we didn't know what it was, and then the stern you can see over on the right hand side there. So we really enjoyed it, and we figured that if you dive Anglesey offshore on low water neaps, you can actually get some really good conditions. So we did quite a few dives in 2006, and we confirmed quite a few features and facts as we were out there. So the wreck is split into two pieces, and they're actually around 50 meters apart. It's a steel or iron hull. It has a counter stern. So if you can imagine the type of sweeping stern that people are familiar with when they look at the Titanic. It had a single boiler, a large winch, a triple expansion steam engine, a single propeller, a beam or a hoop across the stern, and it had a hoop on the port side. And there's a couple of sketches there that Nigel did at the time that showed the layout of the wreck. Now, the wreck had been known about for quite a long time. It had been heavily dived, but it was quite a new dive for our club. So it was quite exciting for us to find a wreck in two pieces and trying to navigate between the two. And it was also on the more challenging side of the club diving that was happening at the time. So 32 to 34 meters. We were probably all diving singles and air back then. You don't get much time on these wrecks. So it was at the challenging end of the spectrum, shall we say. So after this point, we started to do a little bit of research on the Lady Windsor, which is what the wreck was known as. And I believe it was Chris that pulled out these facts, that the Lady Windsor was actually a small steamer. It had a wooden hull. It was used for laying and repairing targets for bombing near Cligby Beach, and it drifted ashore near Llanbadrig. And the wreck was actually burnt on the beach to recover the copper fastenings. So there was no way that this shipwreck could be the Lady Windsor. So we christened the wreck, not the Lady Windsor, and it stayed that way for quite a few years through the course of this project. We shortened that to NTLW. The second question was she a tug? Because she was quite often referred to as the tug wreck. And we've got a couple of pictures of your typical tugs here. And the main reason she was being referred to as a tug is because if you look at the bottom left-hand side, there's this hoop arrangement on the back, which is for running ropes through. And there's a hoop on the back of not the Lady Windsor, although it looks very, very much different. So this is why it was called the tug. So another dive on the site, and we investigated this hoop on the back. And what we actually found out was it was part of the bulwark. So the edge of the hull had actually been ripped up and pulled over the side to give the impression that there was a hoop, but it wasn't. So at this point, we could probably rule out the fact that this was a tug. It doesn't explain the hoop on the side, and it doesn't explain the significantly large winch that tugs don't have. So what are our other options? And when you start ticking off the boxes, steam engine, single boiler, single propeller, large winch, the hoop on the side, we found out later, were trawling gallows and a counter stern, which you can see in that picture there on the back of the boat on the left-hand side. It all points to it being a steam trawler. And there you can see some of the features from archive photographs and on the wreck of the Lady Windsor. So how did she sink? What happened to her? Well, the fact that the wreck is split in two indicates obviously a traumatic end. And the most common reason at this point was ships being mined. So there was potentially two ways it could have happened. Trawlers would quite often snag mines in the nets and bring them up to the actual side of the ship. Or you've got this scenario of a magnetic mine where a metal hull boat would go over it and it would trigger the mine from underneath. So it looked at this point that we had a steam trawler that had been mined off the coast of Anglesey. So we then start doing a little bit more research around steam trawlers off the coast of Anglesey. And you quite quickly come to the reference of the Kincorth. So she was listed as a steam drifter at this point, which is an important thing to note for later on. She's a steam drifter, 148 tons. She was sunk 82 degrees, 7 miles from Linus Point. So it's only a rough bearing that we have as to what happened to the wreck. And it's described as being mined. And I think at this point, we have to bear in mind that the position's approximate because this incident has actually been observed from the shore. The vessel was lost with all hands, so the information didn't come from the sea, it was observed from the shore. You keep searching for the Kincorth off Anglesey, and you'll then find out that it's a known wreck. So the wreck of the Kincorth exists in a number of dive books, some more accurate than others, including this one here about Anglesey Wrecks and Reefs. So we have a wreck that's been dived, that's been identified. So the Kincorth is out there, it's a known wreck. So we'll use this graphic a lot tonight, and this kind of gives an update as to the journey that we go on as part of this project. So we have a wreck called the Kincorth. It's been dived, it's been identified, and it's been written about. We also have our wreck, which is not the Lady Windsor, it's not a tug, but we know it's a steam trawler. It's not the Kincorth, because obviously that's already been found and documented. So what ship is it? And this is where our diving sort of focused at this point. It was looking at the wreck that we didn't know the identity to. That will change later on. So further research on the Kincorth, and in the late 1980s, divers recovered a bell. And this, ironically, was Chester Sub-Aqua Club divers. So they were diving the wreck of the Kincorth. I believe the story goes, two of the divers literally swam up to the wheelhouse. One of them put the hand down and the bell was right next to his hand. So they recovered the bell, they brought it back, and it was marked up the TR4. But back in those days, bells quite often would get moved between ships. So TR4 is obviously just a reference. Everyone just assumes the ship was renamed the Kincorth, or named the Kincorth at some point, but the bell was never renamed. So the reference number TR4 was just on there. So at this point, no one's challenged the fact that the bell might mean something different. The Hydrographic Office also confirms that the wreck in the position of the Kincorth has the reference to TR4. So we engaged with the Hydrographic Office to research that one. and then we have an update. We have a wreck known as the Kincorth, which is a steam trawler with TR4 on the bell. And then we have our wreck. So we get to 2006, 12 months later, and we spent the vast majority of the summer diving on the wreck that we affectionately called Not the Lady Windsor. We completed multiple dives on the wreck. We've done a number of video and photo surveys. We managed to measure the stern of the wreck, so the length and the width of the ship. We measured the dimensions of the steam engine, and we confirmed the location of the bow section 50 metres behind the stern. I've got two main memories from diving these two wrecks, and one of them is the first time swimming from the stern to the bow of the Kincorth. It was a really interesting and fascinating experience. So if you ever get the chance to dive these, for the divers amongst us, you absolutely have to do it and try and swim between the two. We also conducted searches around both parts of the wreck to see if we could find anything else. And other than a few bits of metal here and there, we didn't find anything significant at all. And many hours of library research investigating reports of lost ships off the coast of Anglesey. I'll be honest, that was predominantly Nigel, who spent a huge amount of time researching the wrecks while we were all out diving. So we've pretty much done all we could at this point with the wrecks. So we started to investigate what did the TR4 mean, which led us on to the search for the TR4. And we had a massive stroke of luck here, because when you search for TR4 and trawlers, going back 10 years now, we found a resource from the Canadian Archives, the Canadian Naval Archives, and someone had actually gathered together all the information and all the photographs around the TR building program in Canada and the Castle-class trawlers. And that's where we got all these fantastic photos of all the TR series being built and completed. We were quite fortunate. We were able to basically download every single photo that we could from the archive, because they're not there anymore. So it was a stroke of luck that we found them when we did, because it was only a few months afterwards that they all got taken down. So we had a link now, a link to Canada and a link to the TR4 series. And it was all around scarcity of trawlers and drifter vessels due to the ongoing war efforts. So the Admiralty essentially placed orders with Canada to build these ships to an Admiralty specification. And as you can see from the note there, with the exception of a few late vessels, the programme was completed in November 1918. And when they talk about the closing of the St. Lawrence, that's the St. Lawrence River, and in winter it completely freezes over. So the area that these boats were built, which is now known as Thunder Bay, you can't access Thunder Bay to the sea within winter. So we had a building program in Canada for these TR4 series, TR series Castle-class trawlers. Further research on the Castle-class trawlers and the TR4 led us to a website called the Boatswain's Watch, which is part of Fleetwood Maritime Heritage Trust. So you can see from the website there, we're going back a few years here, but again, this was a brilliant thing and a great clue for us that we found online relatively easily that linked the TR4 to a ship called the Cartagena. So essentially, the TR4 had been sold to the Boston Deep Sea Fishing and Ice Company, and it was renamed Cartagena. And you can see from there, she left Fleetwood in the charge of a deep sea pilot bound for Rio de Janeiro, headed out into a westerly gale, and it was the last time anyone ever saw of her. And it was believed she foundered in the Irish Sea. Further research, again by Nigel, found a reference to the TR4 being renamed the Cartagena in British warships. So the link was always there between the TR4 and the Cartagena, but no one had actually put the two things together until we did. So, looking at the history of the TR4, they are known as the Castle class, built to an Admiralty specification. They were some of the first vessels built in Canada for the Royal Canadian Navy. Built in 1917 at a cost of around £21,000 by the Port Arthur Shipbuilding Company in Ontario. As I mentioned before, the St. Lawrence gets frozen in winter. So the ships were frozen in 1917 to 18, but they were delivered to the Royal Navy in 1919 and crossed the Atlantic 1919 or 1920. And then, unfortunately, she has a bit of a sad history at this point. The TR4 was stored in Inverness before being sold to the Boston Deep Sea Fishing and Ice Company, along with 16 other trawlers for £47,000. So you can see from the initial building cost to then selling 16 of them for a total of £47,000, they lost a significant amount of their value. She was renamed Cartagena at this point. She was laid up in Grimsby and then further laid up in Boulogne and then refitted for trawling duties in Ostend. Then she came back to Fleetwood and was laid up again. So a bit of a quiet and a sad history at this point. And we believe the photograph there is probably the only photograph that we have that is the TR4. If you zoom in on there on the side of the ship, you can just about make out TR4 if you squint ever so slightly. So we think that's the only photo of her under construction. Further digging, we were able to obtain copies of the plans for the Castle class trawlers. So fairly standard design that, again, the divers amongst us would probably recognise that. Steam trawler, trawling gallows. You notice she has a gun mount on the front because these were to be requisitioned by the Navy. And there's the layout from above. So, an update. We now have a wreck that is known as the Kincorth. It had TR4 on the bell, but might this wreck actually be the Cartagena? That's the question mark at this point. And then we have our other wreck, not the Lady Windsor, steam trawler, not the Kincorth at this point in time. So we then start looking at, well, what happened to the Cartagena? And the first reference you find to the Cartagena after she left Fleetwood was the newspaper reports from North Wales when her lifeboat was washed up on the beach at Llandudno. Following the lifeboat, a barrel of oil also washed up, and then a lifebelt washed up, I believe, off the coast of Anglesey as well. So there was 3 artefacts off the ship that were washed up following the storm off the coast of North Wales after she left Fleetwood. And then we enter into a 6-week period of uncertainty because the Cartagena was bound for Rio de Janeiro. The crew were on a bonus to get there without stopping. And we were looking essentially at a 6-week journey. So until the 6 weeks would be up, there would be no decision made about what happened to the Cartagena or a crew. But that didn't stop the next 6 weeks being, let's say, traumatic for the friends and family of all those crew members. So there's quite a lot of newspaper reports at the time. Some you can see there. So missing steam trawler, fateful voyage from Fleetwood, and then Fleetwood's anxiety for the Cartagena. Owners were saying that we're still hopeful. They're on passage. They can do it in one trip. We will have to wait 6 weeks. But then you get some of the quotes from the relatives of the crew who are obviously going through a pretty traumatic time. So still no news as they're waiting this 6 weeks. A mystery surrounding the whereabouts, which is feared to have foundered, remains unsolved. And we're awaiting news from Rio at this point. Then you got a few of the personal comments from the relatives, and you can see one there. For God's sake, give me some news, or else I shall go mad. And I think the press back then were very similar as they are now. There was a lot of conjecture. There was a lot of this could have happened, that could have happened, but no real facts at this point. Interestingly, Mrs. Petterson, who's the wife of one of the crew members, and we'll talk about the Pettersons a bit later. She was quoted as saying there's reasons for hope because her husband had been iced in on another voyage and turned up a number of weeks late. And then there was another story about one of the crew members who sent a letter back to shore having a premonition on his way to the Cartagena and making the statement that he wished he could put the clock back. So you can sort of get a feel at this point that there has been some sort of tragedy, but we don't know what's happened. We can't make any decisions yet, and everyone's in limbo waiting to see what might have happened. So from here you can see the crew of the Cartagena, and I think the key takeaway from this particular slide is they're all local Northwest people. So we've got Liverpool, Thornton, and Bolton there. So it's very much a Northwest industry, fishing and trawling at this point. So it was very much a local story. A few things that we also pulled out from the newspaper reports, that the captain, he was a deep sea master, so he was qualified, but this was his first voyage in command of a trawler. Wilson joined to save money with which to get married. Richard Taylor had a premonition about the loss of the ship. And Paul Petterson and McFarlane were both married with children. And then we get to the point in time where the Cartagena hasn't arrived in Rio de Janeiro, and she's declared lost. And following the loss declaration, we have a Board of Trade inquiry in 1929 that looks to set out what information they have available and what they can determine as to the cause of the loss. So again, we've just picked out a few points here. There seemed to be little doubt that she was overladen to the extent of something like 4 inches. So there's multiple reports at this point to suggest that she may have been overloaded. And this would link back to the fact that we're trying to make the journey from Fleetwood to Rio de Janeiro in one go. They had the option of calling in at islands on the way, but they were going to try and do it in one go. Again, they brought up the fact that Captain Rawlings was a master, but his first voyage in command of a trawler. And then again, Nigel dug out some correspondence between the Admiralty, which is the bottom image there, where it says, "It is observed that these vessels were built by firms not accustomed to the construction of trawlers and that they cannot be regarded as satisfactory ships." So she may have been overloaded. She absolutely hit a storm on passage. The captain was inexperienced, but also, was there a question mark over to the quality of these ships? And then back to the Cartagena Bell. What we didn't know at this point, we found this out later, was that the Bell had been taken to Canada by the person that found it. It was donated to a local museum and then purchased by the Maritime Command Museum in Halifax. So at this point, ironically, the Bell had already returned home and found its way back to Canada. But from our perspective, we needed proof now that the wreck that many believe to be the Kincorth, it's documented, it's been written about, is in fact the Cartagena. And the only way you can do that is to actually get down there and have a look at it. So we had a very, very frustrating 2006, 2007, where we really, really wanted to visit this wreck, but every attempt that we made, we were put out by the weather. Also, the tides were really poor. You're really looking for a neap tide, low water to dive these wrecks, and obviously you need that tide at a weekend where we have the opportunity to actually get out and see it. So we were frustrated for a good 12 months. We went to go diving in Anglesey in June 2007, and we were actually going to dive, not the Lady Windsor, because the weather forecast looked pretty poor. We were forecast to force 3 to 4. So we loaded up the boat, we launched at Trife Booking, we headed out, and as we made our way out to not the Lady Windsor, the forecast was nothing like it was stated. It was flat calm, it was glorious sunshine. So we kind of got to the Kincorth, we all looked at each other, knowing that the Cartagena isn't that much further, and we decided, let's go. Let's take the opportunity, let's take the chance, let's get out there and actually dive. And that's what we did. So, the first dive on the Cartagena. And I talked about having 2 memories earlier, one being the first view of the bow of the Lady Windsor, and this is the second one that absolutely sticks in my mind. So what we do is when we find these wrecks, we drop a weight on with a rope attached with a buoy at the surface. We jump off the boat, we grab hold of the buoy, and we follow the line down to the wreck underneath. And I think we got to about 20 meters in depth. You could see the wreck underneath us, so I was able to let go of the line and basically drift down above the wreck. And this is the first image that I saw, and it's the first image that I took a photograph of. And this is the fare leaders that run the lines from the winch through this pulley mechanism and then out to the trawling gallows. And obviously we spent a lot of time poring over the charts and the plans of the Castle class trawlers. So straight away, we knew that this was a Castle class trawler. Absolutely. But continued to swim around. We identified the trawling gallows that still had their winches in place. The main winch, which is in front of the wheelhouse, exactly where it should be on the plans. The anchors, which are still in position. So again, you might have to squint a little bit at that one, but you can see that the anchor perfectly matches the same as the Castle class trawler, and it's in position there. Both anchors are both still in position. So at this point, as far as we were concerned, we'd confirmed the identity of the Cartagena. We'd matched a number of specific features of the Castle class trawlers to this wreck. We did subsequent dives as often as we could. So things like the galley, which still had the cooking range in there, the forecastle at the front with the lockers, the heads, which to the non-divers amongst us are the marine toilets. They were all still there, they're all in position, and they match up with plans of the Castle class trawler. And we did a video survey of the wreck as well. So when you stack up all the features, plus the fact that the TR4 Bell was recovered from the wreck, we think it's pretty explanatory at this point that this is the wreck of the Cartagena. So we told everyone. We released a statement in a kind of official style, and we sent it to the diving press in the UK. So that was the BSAC Dive magazine at the time and Diver magazine. We posted it up on our website. The local press picked up on it, and then the Canadian press picked up on it as well. So we fielded a number of calls from Canada. You can actually see the guy's name on there. It's a guy called Randy Boswell, interviewed us. We basically relayed the story, and it was published in Canada as well. It being, as far as the Canadians are concerned, a really important piece of their maritime heritage. These were some of the first ships built for a new Canadian Navy. And Granada Reports picked up on it as well. So I guess, again, within the diving community, we're quite used to getting things online. We're quite used to getting things in the diving press, but TV is something most of us will never get involved with. And I hope never to get involved with it as well. But we did. So Granada Reports rang us the same day, I think it was, that we put the press release out. They called me and they said, we'd like to come and do a story. And I was like, oh, right, okay. Yeah, fantastic. But who knows the most about these wrecks? And I'll hold my hands up here. My main role within this was organising the diving. I just loved diving these two wrecks. The person that did the most research was Nigel. He spent a lot of time in libraries, a lot of time poring over books. So he was the absolute person to stick in front of a camera to answer any questions because he knew it all. The only problem was Nigel was asleep on his sofa when Granada Reports turned up. So it fell to me and Chris to stand in and try and wing our way through the interview with Kate Gifford there. And all being well, if the technology works, we can share that report with you.
Now, a maritime mystery stretching back almost 80 years has been solved by a group of divers from Chester.
Yes, the Cartagena, a steam trawler from Fleetwood, sank without trace with 12 crew on board way back in 1928.
All that time, its whereabouts remained a mystery, that is until now, as Kate Gifford reports.
The fate of the Cartagena had baffled enthusiasts for years. In 1928, the steam trawler set sail from Fleetwood with a crew of 12 from around the northwest on board. Bound for Rio de Janeiro, she never made it, and her whereabouts remained a mystery until now. Divers from the Chester Sub-Aqua Club have solved the 80-year mystery and identified it as the wreck of a ship off the coast of Anglesey.
The Cartagena is actually a wreck off the north coast of Anglesey that's been known about for quite a long time, but it's been incorrectly referred to as the Kincorth for many years. What we've actually done is dived it, put all the pieces of the puzzles together and correctly identified it. I mean, the ship is completely intact sitting on the bottom, and a large part of the structures are all still intact. There's winches there, the wheelhouse is still there. Because it has been down there for an extremely long time, it's extremely overgrown. There's lots of plant life and animal life on there now. It's a haven for fish, ironically, with it being a trawler.
What's left of the Cartagena barely resembles a boat. The crew swept away. There are various theories about how she sank.
They were on a bonus to get there quickly. I suspect they piled on the coal. They simply overloaded the ship. It hit a storm off Anglesey and went straight down with all hands.
There was lots of newspaper articles at the time that went into how anxious the relatives were, but because the ship was on passage to Rio and they were on a bonus if they got there, unfortunately the relatives had to wait 6 weeks before they would actually confirm the loss of the ship.
So after an 80-year wait, we know the Cartagena only made it a few hours into its journey to South America. So what next for the Sub-Aqua sleuths?
We have another local wreck near the Cartagena, which we believe is the Kincorth, which is what the Cartagena was incorrectly referred to for many years. So a lot of our diving will now be focused on that.
So the diving detectives are hot on the heels of more deep-sea secrets. Kate Gifford, Wales Tonight.
Wow.
Fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, amazing pictures, amazing.
At least we're able to fill the cylinders, eh, Nigel? Right, just check that everyone can still hear me. Cool. Okay. So, an update, where are we at? We now know that the wreck slightly north of Anglesey, further north of Anglesey, is the Cartagena. But we've still got a question mark over, are not the Lady Windsor wreck? Or is she potentially the Kincorth? So, again, more research onto the Kincorth. Built in 1909, a longliner, therefore no gallows, so a drifter. Owned by Leaper 1909 to 1926, requisitioned for special service. Presumably, this would be minesweeping duties, which a lot of trawlers were requisitioned for during this time. And again, a little bit more of the history there. She was sold numerous times. In 1941, she was fishing from Fleetwood and then reported as mined 7 miles off Point Linus, and again, lost with all hands. And I won't go through all the detail here. We believe these are the only 2 pictures, or certainly the only 2 pictures we've been able to find of the Kincorth. And some of the information on here, so if you look at the length, the beam, and the depth of the ship, the lack of a raised forecastle, and then the information on her engine, that's some of the information that we use to then go back to the wreck and do some additional surveys. We then also got the crew details of the Kincorth. And again, you can see this is very, very much a local story and a local tragedy here. If you look at where all these crew members live, they're pretty much all from Fleetwood and Lowestoft. So again, it's a very local story. You might also notice the ages as well. You've got really young, well, what we almost term kids these days. You've got 18-year-olds, 4 18-year-olds as part of this crew. And then you've got a big gap, and then the next youngest person is 39, and you're into your 40s, 50s, and 60s. And that's essentially because we were missing a generation that were fighting in the war. So you can see the gap there that we had. So is not the Lady Windsor the Kincorth? So you can see some quite distinctive straking on the hull of the Kincorth, which if you look at the pictures of the wreck and squint your eyes slightly and turn your head to one side, we're fairly sure that the straking is visible, albeit overgrown on the wreck. We have that big counter stern, we have the single prop, and we have all the features of a steam trawler. So the beam is approximately correct. We have the triple expansion steam engine. The cylinder diameters are approximately correct. Was she a trawler or was she a longliner or drifter? Because if she was a longliner or drifter, she wouldn't have any gallows, and our wreck has gallows. She doesn't have the raised forecastle, which matches, and we think the chafing bars are there, and she's in two pieces, so that's consistent with being mined. And then I guess the last piece that enabled us to, with some certainty, put the Kincorth name to our wreck is, again, Nigel found two references to the Kincorth having trawling as a means of fishing. So both in the Lloyd's Register and her fishing agreements, her method of fishing is listed as trawling. So it looks like she may have been outfitted for trawling later on in her life. And indeed, there's only one of the trawl gallows actually in position on the wreck. There is another trawl gallow laid down and fixed onto the stern, so it looks like it's in storage. So presumably they were able to just mount these on as and when they were required. So in conclusion for us, we excluded other possible wrecks due to size, position of sinkings and type of wrecks in the area. Documentation confirmed the Kincorth was indeed trawling when she was lost, and the size and layout of the wreck is consistent with the Kincorth. And taking into account magnetic variation, the wreck is close to the reported location of the loss of the Kincorth, and the damage to the wreck is consistent with mining. So it's therefore highly likely that the wreck that we know as not the Lady Windsor is actually the Kincorth. We can't prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt because there isn't anything there that we can very specifically match up. Her bell has never been found. We've looked really hard for that. But in all likelihood, this is the Kincorth. We kind of done the diving, done the research, we'd documented everything, and I guess you kind of think on one hand that, well, we've done the job now, we've finished the project. But it was only afterwards that we then started to be contacted by various people who had an association with the two wrecks. So this is kind of a few slides on the human interest. And we took a visit up to Fleetwood, and there is a trawler monument up there, a trawler memorial, and there's a quote that says, "The real price of fish is the lives of men." And yeah, that very much applies in both of these cases. So following the identification and the publication and publicity around the identification of Cartagena, we were contacted by numerous people. So Kai Paul Gleiser Petterson, grandson of Paul Petterson, contacted us first, and they were based in Fleetwood still. We were contacted by Heather Gratrix Hornby, great niece of Lawrence Gratrix, who was the chief engineer. Patricia Mareka, great niece of Albert Harold Palmer, who was the superintendent engineer of the Boston Deep Sea Fishing and Ice Company. John Douglas, grandson of Harold Douglas, who was the second engineer of the Kincorth. Norma Rhodes, also a granddaughter of Paul Petterson. And Debbie Wilson, a great-granddaughter of Paul Petterson from the Cartagena as well. And as some of you may have heard before we started the presentation, we were contacted today by Andy Petterson, who is the great-great-grandson of Paul Petterson, who's currently at Nautical College. So we'll be sharing this presentation with him, and I guess it's interesting that the nautical theme continues in the Petterson family. And all these contacts were able to share some really interesting information and artifacts with us, and we haven't got time to go through everything today, so we just picked out a few. So these are photos of Kai Petterson that was supplied to us by his family. So he had a career in the Navy before he ended up on the trawlers out of Fleetwood. So some amazing photographs. And we, as I mentioned before, we went up to Fleetwood and we actually met Kai and his wife June. So we talked about the wreck. They had some of their own history. They had a painting commissioned of the wreck. So they had a painting of what the Cartagena might have looked like on the wall, which we got a picture of. And then later on, we invited them down to try and take them out to the site of the wreck. And the plan was we were going to lay reef on the weekend in Anglesey. Unfortunately, as it has done in the past, the weather stopped us from getting out. So unfortunately, they couldn't stay for a whole weekend, but we did manage to go out a bit later on. And there's a photo of Chris there, who managed to get the reef down onto the Cartagena. And then Chris also received a letter from John Douglas. So again, this was a really nice one to receive. His grandfather and uncle were both on the Cartagena. So he shared some photographs of Harold Douglas and George Douglas there. So again, age 51 and aged 18. So kind of two generations of a family lost on the wreck. So we ended up with a story, kind of from start to finish. We had a mystery, we did some research, we did a lot of diving, and we came to a conclusion. It's like, well, what do we do with this story now? So we were encouraged to submit the entire story for the BSAC Rec Award and the Nautical Archaeological Society Adopt a Rec Award, because at this point in time, we were going through the process of adopting both the Cartagena and the Kincorth through the Nautical Archaeological Society scheme. So we did. And that's essentially where this presentation came from. We put the timeline together, we put all our facts and photographs in and our research, and that's where the presentation came from. So we submitted both of those. BSAC Rec Award was an online submission, and we came runners-up for the BSAC Rec Award in 2014, and we got highly commended for that one. For the Adopt a Rec Award, we were invited down to London to present the story at the NAS conference, which again was a really interesting day out. It was really good fun. So we went down there. When we were asked to present it, I thought there'd be, I don't know, 5 or 6 people in a room. We were just going to do a little presentation and then someone would make a decision and that would be it. No, it was a big conference centre. There was a fair few hundred people in there. It's like, oh, okay. But fortunately, because we were quite enthusiastic about our story and obviously we knew it because we'd done it, it wasn't too overwhelming, and we did a fairly good job, I think, presenting our story. We were co-presenting with another group that were called the London Project, and they'd identified a galleon in the River Thames, and they were doing all sorts of diving and all sorts of archaeology on this galleon in the Thames. And you sort of, I certainly was sort of stood there at the side thinking, bloody hell, they've done all this diving on an actual galleon. I mean, that's proper historic. We just went diving on 2 trawlers off the coast of Anglesey. So I did make the point when we were on stage, it felt a little bit fraudulent at the time that we'd just gone diving and had a great time doing some research. You know, these guys had done some proper archaeology. But we got a quote from Innes McCartney at the time, who, again, many of the divers will recognise that name. He's done a lot of research into deep wrecks and especially U-boats and written lots of books. And he basically made the point, you can do all the research, you can come up with all the theories, but until someone actually gets under the water and puts their hands on these things and you know, checks what's actually down there, you don't actually know. And that's the archaeology behind all this. So we felt a little bit better after Innes made that comment, so that was quite nice. So we were joint winners with the London Project. And in order to get Nigel back, we've got his picture up there, since he couldn't make the Granada Reports TV piece. That trophy might have got dropped at some point fairly soon after this photograph was taken, but we couldn't possibly admit to that one. So, the end. Well, not quite. We've quite often referred to these wrecks, both of them, the 2 wrecks, that they're the wrecks that keep on giving. So just when you think the story's ended, we'll either get contacted by someone else, maybe another person, another relative, or another piece of work comes about that involves the 2 wrecks. And that's what happened fairly recently with the U-boat project, Wales. 1914 to 1918, and I'm going to hand over to Nigel now to talk through this one.
I just wanted to emphasise that I am actually a diver and not entirely a librarian, as portrayed by Justin. At the time they were diving the wrecks, I was signed off diving for medical reasons, so I was busy reading books and things in the background, which was a way of distracting myself from the frustration of not being able to go and visit these wrecks. So having adopted the wreck through the NAS Adopt a Wreck scheme after winning the award, in 2017 we were approached by NAS. We were planning to use the Cartagena as the subject of a field school to be held in North Wales as part of the U-boat project run by the Royal Commission for Ancient and Historical Monuments in Wales. And it's a project which has been going on around the coast of Wales to commemorate the forgotten and under-researched wrecks of the First World War that lie off the Welsh coast, funded by Heritage Lottery Fund. And the field school, if you just move on a click for me, Justin, took place in June 2018, sponsored by Nautical Archaeological Society. And I think Ian Cundy, who was the organiser of that, I saw his name earlier on in the list of people who joined us, is listening in. HLF funded, and there's a list of the things we did as part of the field school there. There was an attempt at photogrammetry of the wreck, but what we found was there was so much dead men's fingers and marine life on the wreck that actually it wasn't really possible to get very good multi-dimensional images. Bangor University, who were also part of the project, undertook a fair degree of multi-beam sonar work, and they did the Cartagena, and they did a series of other wrecks from the First World War around the Welsh coast. We had a programme of dives over the weekend of the field school, and then NAS set up a whole suite of onshore activities on the beach at Trythebuchan, and there was lots of interactions with the public, explaining to them the story of the wreck. And then we also got the opportunity to do a bit more documentary research. And these two images on the right are examples of the multi-beam sonar work that was done by Bangor. I like the picture at the bottom there. The waves in the sand on the seabed look like the waves of the sea, and the ship looks as if it's still almost trying to make progress towards somewhere. But you can make out the detail of the wreck. You can see in the top image on the right-hand side, the forecastle at the bow, the lump in front of the wheelhouse, which is the winch, the wheelhouse itself, and then the boiler room casing, the skylight over the engine room, and then the after accommodation. And she's tilted over slightly to port. And Bangor University were able to produce this, which is a 3D printed model based on those three-dimensional multi-beam sonar images, which is amazing, really. I think it cost them quite a lot of money because it's printed in colour, and the guy who brought it was very, very careful to make sure he kept one hand on it all the time, because I think everybody fancied lifting it. But an amazing amount of detail, and again, you can see the forecastle, you can see the winch at the end of the well deck, and the wheelhouse, and the hole where the funnel would have been, and the after accommodation, and even the fan of frames around the stern. And in that well deck in front of the winch, you can see the beams which would have held up the deck. And if you reached down between those beams, you could pick up lumps of coal, which is presumably in the fish hold from where she's been loaded up for a voyage. And we think this was one of the differences between the Canadian-built trawlers and the British-built ones, in that the Canadian ones seem to have had wooden decks, whereas the British ones had steel decks. So we'd always known that the log of the TR4 existed in the Canadian archive, but we'd never been able to get our hands on it. So using some support from the field school, we were able to get a researcher to go in and have a look at the log. The log extends from July 1918 to March 1919. The front cover is marked up as HMCS TR4 with a Roman numeral, and we're assuming that stands for His Majesty's Canadian Trawler. And she was based in the minesweeping section at Halifax. And the guy who looked through the log for us said she either seemed to be in Halifax or Dartmouth, which is just literally across the harbour. So she was coming and going from those two places. And the photo there we found shows some of the trawlers moored up in the harbour at Halifax, and for all we know, TR4 could be one of those trawlers there. And the log's beautifully written. It's very clear and very legible, and we got some choice pieces picked out of it. So July 1918, the skipper came aboard and took command, and she left ready to stand by for minesweeping, tying up alongside her sister TR3. 11th of November, they were all called in to the patrol office to hear the announcement of the armistice. But then by March 1919, she's making some water, so she's presumably moored up now, 18 inches of water in 72 hours, presumably coming into the hull. And then the final entry in the log, A few days later, hands proceeding to HMCS Niobe, which was an ex-Royal Navy cruiser used as a depot ship in the harbour, and she's been laid up. Seacocks closed, lashed, and all the doors locked except the galley because the lock was broken. Quite a mundane war, I suppose, minesweeping out of Halifax every day, and that's what the log suggests. But the TR trawlers did get into action, and by 1918, German submarines were actually crossing the Atlantic and waging war on the eastern seaboard of the United States. And the picture here is the U-156, which went down as far as New York, laid various mines, including the ones that sunk the USS San Diego, which was the largest American warship lost in the First World War, and then made its way back up. And in Canadian waters, she was sinking trawlers and fishing vessels. She actually captured one trawler and they put a German crew aboard it and then used it to lure other trawlers in and sink those. And the ship in the bottom right there, HMCS Ochelga, was patrolling with one of the TR series trawlers and saw the U-156. And Ochelga was part of a patrol with a couple of other ships. And they saw the U-156 in the distance, busy sinking Canadian ships. And Ochelga and the TR-22 turned and fled back towards the other ships in her patrol. And as she fled, she signalled, "I see reinforcements coming up from astern. Should we wait for them?" And the commanding officer of the patrol said, "No, we need to turn round and engage the enemy." But by the time they got there, the U-156 had submerged and gone on her way. And the captain of the Ochelga was court-martialed and dismissed from the Navy for failing to make the utmost effort to bring his ship into action, which I think is about as close as you could get to cowardice. But you can see his point. You can see the pop gun on the front of the Ochelga, which is very similar to what would have been mounted on the trawlers. And then you can see the size of those guns on the submarines. So perhaps a wise decision. And then we also knew that up in the archives, in the Highland Archive in Inverness, because we made some inquiries up there whether they had any information on the ships when they were stored in Inverness, that they held the log of a ship called CD-76. So you might remember in the early stages of the talk, Justin mentioning the TR series trawlers and then also some drifters being built. Well, these were all named CD-76. There were 100 of those. The Canadians didn't adopt a terribly imaginative naming scheme. So the trawlers were called TR and the drifters were called CD for Canadian drifter. And she made the voyage across the Atlantic in 1920. And in her log, you can recognize the names of 8 of the TR series trawlers. And these were tiny ships, 84-foot long wooden hulled drifter. But it does give you an idea of the voyage the Cartagena TR4 must have made. So the CD-76 left Halifax in September 1920. It looks as if she was actually towed by one of the TR series trawlers for much of it. It looks as if the trawler was actually towing 2 of them. But somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, they got into a major storm. She started taking on water. She lost the TR trawler that was towing her. They write in the log of the fore part of the ship being full of water and the hold being full and then trying to bail it out. They use the rather euphemistic phrase, "We will struggle to keep her up at this rate." And by the 4th of October, they were actually provisioned the lifeboat and had it ready for launching. And they write in the log that if the weather doesn't moderate soon, we're going to lose her. Fortunately, the weather did ease a bit. They managed to keep bailing her. They managed to get the bow up. And 7 days later, they managed to creep into Fayal in the Azores, 600 miles with the ship on its last legs. They spent an inordinate amount of time in the Azores fixing the thing up, set out again. By the 4th of December, they were in Falmouth with a considerable amount of water in the vessel again. They bailed her out, went on their way. By the 8th of December, they'd staggered into Milford Haven with the boiler leaking seriously. They must have botched it having up, or maybe she was towed. And she finally reached Inverness in December 1920. So a 3-month voyage. But it gives you a bit of an impression of perhaps what it was like bringing these ships, which had by that time been laid up in Halifax Harbour for probably a year, 18 months, across the Atlantic. And the final little snippet on the Cartagena's history that came out of the docu research was this crew agreement from 1926, which discusses a voyage from Grimsby to Boulogne, 3 people on board, because she was in tow. Not entirely clear why that's the case. Had the ships degenerated whilst they were stored in Inverness to the extent where they weren't really serviceable? That's a possibility. There's records of one of her sisters, the TR1, being bought by the Royal New Zealand Navy from Rotten Row in Inverness. But it's also possible September 1926, time of the general strike, they just couldn't get any coal for her, and they decided to tow her down because she was left in Boulogne for coal and repairs. And that's the last sort of documentary trace of her. And why did she sink? Well, as part of the field school, given the depth, we were a little bit wary of having people down there with lots of tape measures and things, but we did ask people to inspect the hull and see if they could find any evidence of why she might have gone down, something we perhaps missed. It was noticed that the bow was bent. She'd obviously crashed into something in her lifetime, but it didn't seem to be sufficient to sink her. Why is she where she is? Well, she would have been heading around the Skerries, so she seems to be south of her course. Was she heading into the coast of Anglesey to seek shelter? Did she observe the light at Point Linus and turn to try and get round the northern side of Anglesey and broach and turned over? Was she trying to get into the Menai and she turned for there? Was that wooden deck leaking and the hold full of coal just gradually filled? There was mention in the inquiry report that somebody said the freeing ports weren't sufficient. Did she just fill with water and tip over? But whatever happened, it must have been sudden because none of the crew got off. And then finally, just a little piece of information that turned up on the Kincorth on her history in World War I. And Justin mentioned mining. And it turned out that she had been requisitioned for work on mining up at Scapa Flow, probably, we think, associated with laying defensive mines around the base. And there's a note there saying no drifters are available but the small trawler, which is another useful link to confirm that she was a trawler. Kincorth is now at Aberdeen, has been surveyed and suitable, and she was taken up in February 1917 along with her crew who were signed on. But then something else in April, basically the people they'd passed her on to in Scapa Flow saying, no, she's not suitable, she's too deep drafted. And they passed her on into normal Navy duties, swapped her out with a drifter called the Magnet. And for now, she's disappeared back into the mists of history again, and perhaps somewhere in the Public Record Office, there's further stuff on what she did on the war, but we haven't found it yet. So that's it.
Okay, thanks, Nige. So just to round up, and we said it'd be about an hour, so timing is pretty much spot on. Further resources and reading for those of you that might be interested. If you want to actually see what the Cartagena looks like, if you go onto YouTube and search A Tale of Two Trawlers, the Cartagena, we can escort you on a dive. So we put this together for the Rec Award submissions. So there's a dive on there in great visibility and a tour of the wreck and some explanations to what all the different bits are. The U-boat project, Wales, that Nigel's talked you through, that's got some really fantastic bits of information on. They surveyed not just the Cartagena, but additional wrecks. They've turned the 3D model, the sonar imagery into 3D models. So you can go in and you can basically have your own little tour of the wrecks there, and you can rotate them around and zoom in and all that good stuff. So that's worth a look at. And then we thought we'd mention Fleetwood Maritime Heritage Trust and the Boatswain's Watch as well, which are both resources online. The web link is there. If you're interested in trawlers especially, it's just an amazing resource that I think Jim Porter puts a huge amount of effort in. And it was that website that led us to the initial link between the TR4 and the Cartagena, very fortuitously. So that's a good one to look at as well. Okay. And that's the end of our presentation on A Tale of Two Trawlers for the evening, which is pretty much bang on an hour. So we offered up people to ask any questions if they wanted to. So I'm going to hand over to Mart Holloway, who'll coordinate that for us. And you can use the chat window if you'd like to ask any questions.
So the chat window's open whenever you'd like to add any questions. There's no questions on there at the moment. So quite happy to open up the mute for anyone to unmute and ask any questions of Justin, Nigel or Chris.
And if there's no questions, that's fine, because it just means that we've done a fantastic...
I got one. I got one. I've got my logbook in front of me. The 8th of July 06, not the Lady Windsor. And the 23rd of the 6th 07, not the Lady Windsor again. Better visibility on the second time. Water was a bit choppy in the first go.
I was going to dig out my logbook, Dave, because I think my first log book entry on the Kincorth was quite scathing. And for those that are interested, I mean, coincidentally, my first dive on the Kincorth was with Nigel. We went down the shot line, we found the edge of the hull. I literally held on to Nigel's BCD with my left hand. We scooted about 10 metres down the hull, turned round, saw a lobster, came back again, and then surfaced. It was absolutely shocking. There was also the incident of the two divers that ran up about 22 minutes of deco that meant that the other half of the boat couldn't do their dive. So it was one of those days out that we call a learning event, should we say.
It's possibly worth noting that the great-granddaughter is also watching this presentation tonight.
I thought I saw her name.
Deb Wilson. I did message you, Justin.
Sorry, I locked up there, Mart. I didn't get any of that.
I've messaged you who it was.
And then I think the Kincorth's the only ship I've ever dived where the bow points at the stern.
Oh, Debbie Wilson.
Yeah, Debbie Wilson
Hello,
and
Debbie.
her brother.
Hi, Debbie. Glad you could make it. And if you want a copy of the presentation, as we said, we'll post the link up. So if you want that, no problem. And if you want any other info, we were actually talking to Nigel and Chris last night. We've got literally so much information on these now. We could probably talk about them for 3, 4, 5 hours. So what we'll try and do over the next 12 months or so is get all that information together with all the various contacts, the emails, the photographs. It'll take a little bit of work, but we'll try and do that and get that out into the public because it needs to be out there so people have got access to it.
Yeah, that's great, thank you. I remember my mum getting in contact with you when she saw you on Granada Reports, and I think that started the whole thing off. And then we brought Dad to Chester to bring the wreath, which you very kindly took down to the wreck. It was just unfortunate that he couldn't go out with you to to the area, but we're really grateful for everything you've done and keeping us posted with everything. Thank you.
No problem. Our pleasure. And I've just seen Andy Petterson's put a question up as well, so we did manage to make it on. So yes, Andy, the TR4 Bell is currently on display at the museum in Halifax. We haven't got out there ourselves to see it in person yet, but hopefully that's something we might do at some point.
One point of interest, well, we went off at a bit of a tangent on the Kincorth. I found a chart published in 1880 which shows a wreck exactly where what we now know as the Kincorth is. So we were looking for a much earlier wreck, and it wasn't until we found it was a notice to mariners basically saying this wreck on the chart, nothing's been found, we don't know where the source came from, it's now been deleted. So over 40 years before the Kincorth hit the mine, there was somebody had a premonition and put a wreck on the chart exactly where the Kincorth sank. I find that very, very weird, very strange, but that's life.
There is a story about the bell because I rang the Maritime Museum in Halifax to ask them about the bell. And I'd been told that the bell had been donated to the museum. The person who found the bell gave the bell to a Canadian naval officer to donate it to the museum. And I was speaking to the director of the museum, and she was extremely cold and frosty to me. And I was trying to be all happy because we'd found her shipwreck and linked it all together and everything. And it came out that actually the museum had bought the bell off eBay. And we still can't reconcile those two events. Our club member swore blind it had been donated to the museum swears blind they bought it off eBay. And she said to me, is this the way British divers treat marine heritage? And I had to swallow my pride and explain that it wasn't, and we were honest, and we were just interested in finalising the history of the wreck. I was tempted to say it was just the way we treated Canadian maritime heritage, but I didn't think that was probably the moment of the conversation to say that.
That's the sort of thing Dave Parry would say.
Yeah, that would be the Dave Parry special.
I'm very diplomatic if you don't mind. Not.
Yeah.
I think in the end we went around and we've sent the information through to them. And yeah, I think you're right, Justin. That would be a good place for the archive information to sit with the Bell. And the Bell's in Halifax, where she sailed from. It's all quite circular in its way.
Hmm.
What's the story about the trophy then? Where's that? Or how many pieces is that in now?
The trophy goes back to NAS to get handed to the next worthy recipient.
Oh, does it? Which one did he get rid of then?
Oh, actually,
He's got the little one.
I got
Oh.
the little one.
Isn't there one in the club? No.
No. Martin wouldn't let it in because it was quotes tat.
Got off tat.
I think we should dive again soon.
Okay, so I'm going to take it off recording now because Dave's talking a lot. So I'm going to